In the late 80s and early 90s, Frankfurt streets became a hunting ground for a ruthless killer, taking the lives of several women in brutal attacks. Fear gripped the community, and police arrested Leoard Christopher, a local fish market worker, convicting him for one of the murders.
I call him a classic serial signature killer because he left his mark on all the bodies.
But as new evidence and doubts emerged, questions about Christopher's guilt and the possibility of a wrongful conviction began to surface.
In September of 1990, while Christopher was in jail awaiting trial, there was a 9th stabbing that appeared to be the work of the Frankford Slasher.
Join us as we unravel this complex case and uncover why, even decades later, the mystery of the Frankford Slasher remains unsolved. Welcome to Grim Riddle's Crime Stories. As always, viewer discretion is advised. We would love to hear your thoughts and opinions on this controversial case, and if you enjoy the video, please like, share, and consider subscribing. With that said, we invite you to sit down and get comfortable. This is the case of the Frankford Slasher. Between the piled railroad ties and the scepter train yard at Penn and Bridge Streets in Philadelphia lay the lifeless body of a woman. It was a humid morning on August the 26th, 1985, around 8:30 a.m., when transit workers stumbled upon her. The woman was found partially unclothed, with her blouse pulled up and legs provocatively positioned. She was identified the next day as 52-year-old Helen Patent of Parkland, Pennsylvania. Her end was brutal, with an autopsy revealing 47 vicious stab wounds to her head and chest and a savage slash across her abdomen. Detectives pieced together her final moments, tracing her last sighting to August the 19th at her Bucks County home, according to her former husband Kermit Patent. The motive for her murder remained elusive. Speculation ranged from a chance encounter gone awry in local bars to darker possibilities. Her death marked the beginning of a sinister pattern. Over the next 18 months, 3 more victims fell prey to the same assailant, earning him a chilling moniker in the local press, the Frankford Slasher. Early in 1986, on the bleak morning of January the 3rd, another victim surfaced. Anna Carroll, aged 68, lived in a different part of Philadelphia on the 1400 block of Rittner Street. Her apartment door stood open in the biting winter air, revealing her lifeless body sprawled on the bedroom floor. She was nude from the waist down, stabbed 6 times in the back, with a grotesque post-mortem wound slashed from breastbone to groin, as if the killer sought to disembowel her. A kitchen knife was left embedded in her. Though 10 miles separated this scene from where Helen Patent had been discovered, the brief interval between the incidents, the similar condition of the bodies, and their nocturnal timings hinted at a common predator. Yet the authorities hesitated to actively pursue this connection. Anna Carroll, like Patent, had frequented the bars in Frankfurt, as reported by the Philadelphia Inquirer. Nearly a year later, on Christmas Day, the next victim emerged. All 3 women had been seen at Goldie's, the Golden Bar on the 5200 block of Frankfurt Avenue, near the elevated train terminal. Susan Olszef, 64, discovered in her Richmond Street apartment, bore 6 stab wounds in her back. Richmond Street lay just 7 miles from the first murder scene. Frankfurt Avenue, originally known as the King's Highway, has a rich history dating back to before Philadelphia was even founded. This historic road was a key route for travellers and commerce, serving as a vital link between the northern colonies and the burgeoning city of Philadelphia. It was part of the network of Native American trails that European settlers later expanded and improved upon. Frankfurt itself was a significant town in its own right, with bustling markets, inns and taverns that catered to travellers and locals alike. The area around Frankfurt Avenue was known for its vibrant community and economic activity, becoming an important hub for industry and trade. The road witnessed the passage of many significant events and figures in American history, contributing to the development and growth of Philadelphia. The arrival of the L, the elevated train, in 1922 brought prosperity, but by the 1980s it had decayed into a crime-ridden slum teeming with prostitutes, junkies, and struggling businesses. Sylvester Stallone even chose its gritty backdrop for his film Rocky. The King's Highway, a 13-block stretch of Frankfurt Avenue, was a bustling thoroughfare under the L shadow, where commuters hurriedly scattered to their destinations. The nightlife that drew people to Frankfurt also hampered the murder investigation. Its ceaseless activity made it a prime spot for an anonymous crime. The police, failing to see the connection between the murders due to their spread across different city areas, were left without solid leads after 3 killings. Then, on January the 8th, 1987 at 7:30 a.m., the 4th victim was discovered. Jeanne Durkin lived on the streets, mostly in the doorway of an abandoned bakery 2 buildings away from Goldie's. She was 28 and potentially an easy victim for predators. Her body was found by a restaurant employee on a Pratt Street lot west of Frankford Avenue, owned by a fruit vendor, and she had been stabbed in the chest, buttocks and back, a total of 74 times. This was 1 block from where Helen Patent had been killed. Lying in a pool of blood, Durkin was nude from the waist down, and her legs were spread. Blood was spattered against a fence and the side of the truck. An autopsy indicated that she had been essayed. Once she became victim number 4, the newspapers began to pressure the police to solve these crimes. It was clear by now that Philadelphia had a serial killer on the loose. In fact, between 1985 and 1989, the city of brotherly love experienced 3 separate series of brutal murders. While the crimes of the Frankford Slasher were being investigated, the police learned from a woman who had escaped about an eccentric man who was holding females prisoner in his house on North Marshall Street. Harold Schlechter tells the story in the Serial Killer Files. 1 captive had died from hanging in chains for several days, and 1 had been killed. The police invaded the home and found 3 more nearly dead women chained in a filthy basement. A man named Gary Heidnick had used them as sex slaves. After his arrest, he admitted to eating pieces of 1 victim and feeding some to his other prisoners. Then, on a sweltering August day in 1987, Harrison Marty Graham was evicted from his North Philadelphia apartment because of obnoxious odours. He left, but the smell worsened, so the police went in. They discovered the decomposing corpses of 6 women, with the remains of a 7th. Graham tried to claim that the bodies were there when he moved in, but then confessed to strangling them, all during sex. Despite his insanity plea, a judge convicted him in every single case. The authorities quickly formed a task force to canvass the Frankford Avenue neighbourhood to see if they could find anyone who had witnessed anything related to the victims. They questioned a female bartender at Goldie's for several hours because she had seen the women, and even knew that Durkin often came in during the winter to get warm. They also talked with many other customers, past and present. The bartender, D. Hughes, told Thomas Gibbons from the Enquirer that she figured the killer was a customer. "I honestly believe it was someone that comes in here and got to know them." She indicated a man who she suspected, but could not offer anything that she had actually seen. Olszef had been in the bar only 3 days before she was murdered, and she talked to people, but Carroll generally kept to herself and bought her own drinks. According to the interviews, those who knew the 4th victim did not believe she could have been overwhelmed easily. At one point, when 6 policemen had tried to arrest her, she struggled so much that they gave up. That led investigators to believe that she may have known her attacker, and that he had used cunning, not strength, to get her into a vulnerable position. A woman named Michelle Martin, who also frequented the Frankford Avenue bars, had argued with Durkin over a blanket just the night before, but nothing more actually tied Martin to the victim. In and out of mental institutions, Durkin had been living on the streets for the past 5 years. She was savvy and independent. Some people felt the same about Helen Patent, believing she would never have gone with a stranger to the train yard. And the police were stumped. On January the 20th, 50 people from the neighbourhood brought candles to the L to pray for the victims and alert the killer that they were on the lookout for him. Many wept for the street women, the mother of 4, who had been a part of their community. By January 1988, as recorded in the papers, the police had tentatively decided that the killings might not be related, despite the similar circumstances. But over the next year, they had to rethink this position. Margaret Vaughn, aged 66, was discovered in the foyer of an apartment building on the 4900 block of Penn Street. Evicted that same day for non-payment of rent, Vaughn had been stabbed 29 times. A barmaid recalled Vaughn's last evening. She had been drinking at the bar with a Caucasian man, round-faced, limping, and wearing glasses. The witness provided enough detail for a police artist to create a sketch distributed around town, but no one came forward to identify him. Then, on January the 19th, 1989, the gruesome discovery of Theresa Sciortino's body sent shivers through the community. Sciortino, 30, was found in her Arrett Street apartment, stabbed 25 times. Living alone, she had been an outpatient at several psychiatric institutions. Her lifeless body, clothed only in white socks, lay face up in a pool of blood on her kitchen floor. The attacker had not only slashed her face, arms and chest with a sharp knife, but had also used a 3-foot piece of wood to assay her. A bloody footprint was on the floor, and the blood-stained weapon leaned against the sink. A neighbour had heard a struggle the previous evening, along with a loud thump. The apartment was in a mess, with blood splattered everywhere, showing that Theresa had fiercely fought her attacker. Like the other victims, Sciortino frequented the Frankfurt Avenue strip and often entertained male companions. A neighbour commented that she had a lot of company. She was last seen alive at the Jolly Post Tavern in the company of a middle-aged white man at around 6 p.m. Not long after, a neighbour heard the fatal scuffle. Detective Lieutenant James Henwood stated that with this 6th victim, they were revisiting the possibility of a serial killer in Frankfurt.
I call him a classic serial signature killer because he left his mark on all the bodies.
John Appledorn commanded a special task force of homicide investigators who put together a frightening picture of the slasher and how he worked, posing as a counselor, even renting space in a nearby church. He approached victims like Susan Olszef in bars, offering guidance and consolation.
He would probably cozy up to him, get him out of the bar, and then do what he's going to do.
Each victim, like 28-year-old Jeanne Durkin, who was stabbed 74 times, sexually assaulted and butchered.
Yeah, it was terror, absolute terror.
However, medical examiner Paul Hoyer held a mistaken belief that serial killers typically kill more frequently, with only weeks between attacks. Despite differing ages, from 28 to 68, all victims were white women who frequented the same area, had been viciously stabbed. There was little evidence left at the scene, and there were no witnesses. Detectives by this time had amassed boxloads of interview transcripts with local employees and patrons, but had found no leads. They searched sewers and trash bins around Sciortino's apartment in vain for a murder weapon. Then there was one more. On April the 29th, 1990, at nearly 2 a.m, a patrol officer stumbled upon a ghastly sight in an alley behind Newman's Seafood at 4511 Frankfurt Avenue. There, lying naked and lifeless, was Carroll Dowd, aged 46. Her head and face were brutally battered, and her body bore 36 stab wounds spread across her face, neck, chest and back. Her abdomen had been slashed open, exposing her intestines, and her left nipple had been removed. Defensive wounds on her hands suggested a desperate struggle against her attacker. The officer had been checking the area due to a recent burglary and estimated Dowd had been murdered sometime after midnight and before 1:40 a.m. Dowd lived not far from the scene, and a witness recalled seeing her walking with an older white man only a few hours earlier. Her clothes were found near her body, and her open purse lay in the alley, its contents spilled onto the ground. With nothing taken, robbery was ruled out, though later reconsidered. Her brother revealed that Dowd's life had taken a dark turn in the late 1960s after their brother's death, leading her to hear voices. Diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, she was institutionalized and later moved into an apartment. Recently, she had been residing in a community facility where she seemed happy. Immediately, the police suspected the same killer from the 7 previous cases in the area. They theorized that he had followed his victims after they left bars at night or grabbed them en route to their destinations. They interviewed employees of the fish market, including Leoard Christopher, who worked there and lived nearby. Christopher mentioned the store had been burglarized recently, and when he saw the police in the alley, he assumed it was another break-in or a drug or prostitution bust. Learning it was a murder investigation, he admitted knowing Margaret Vaughn, one of the earlier victims. Christopher's familiarity with the area and the victims aroused suspicion. Questioned about his whereabouts the night before, he claimed to have been with his girlfriend, but she told detectives she had spent the night alone. This discrepancy led to more intense questioning, and witnesses emerged placing Christopher with Dowd in a bar that night. A reluctant prostitute eventually admitted seeing them together outside the bar, while another saw him leaving the alley by the fish store, sweating and with a large knife in his belt. A search of Christopher's apartment revealed clothing with blood on it. Christopher called a friend at the store, saying the police suspected him. The friend, who remained anonymous, told the newspaper their boss had instructed Christopher to clean up blood in the alley, explaining the blood on his clothing. Colleagues vouched for his good character and humanitarian nature, feeling it wrong to blame him for the murders. Christopher's landlord confirmed these positive impressions, noting only that he sometimes made too much noise. Despite being a black man, and not the middle-aged white man seen with other victims, Christopher was arrested and arraigned on May the 5th, charged with robbery, abuse of a corpse, murder, and possession of an instrument of a crime. He was held without bail.
In 1990, we covered an 8th killing that seemed to be in the Frankford Slasher pattern.
46-year-old Carroll Dowd disemboweled in this alley.
But the suspect authorities arrested for Carroll Dowd's murder didn't fit the sketch they'd been circulating. The man arrested was black, 38-year-old Leoard Christopher, who suddenly became the face of the Frankford Slasher.
In a way, that bothered him more than the fact that his freedom had been taken away.
Yet, even as he sat in jail, another woman in the Frankfurt Avenue area was about to meet the same fate as the previous victims. Now people began to question whether the police had arrested the wrong man. Leoard Christopher did not resemble the middle-aged white man seen with 2 other victims shortly before they were killed, and many people vouched for him as a decent, friendly individual. If the police had falsely arrested him, the real killer had been free all this time and had likely struck again. On October the 27th, 50 citizens of Philadelphia solemnly marched through the rain-soaked streets of Frankfurt, following the routes they imagined the killer of 9 potential victims had taken. Despite the windy and cold weather, no one seemed to mind. Past the fish market, the newspaper reported, behind which one body was found butchered with a knife, past a bar that 4 of the dead had patronized, and along Urrott Street, where the latest victim was found, stabbed to death early last month. They lit candles, sang hymns, and prayed, creating a tribute to the women who couldn't be here. They also read from the Bible and spoke out against the violence in their neighbourhood. Homicide detectives patrolled the streets, watching women who went in and out of bars who looked like potential victims, hoping to glimpse a man who might act or look suspicious. They had investigated more than 50 men seen leaving the bars with women and had 2 men under surveillance and leads on a third. Yet, with no clear pattern to the killings in terms of time frame or victim type, they were working blind. It was surprising that no one had seen a man with blood on him in the streets. All the victims had been viciously stabbed, and their attacker must have been covered in blood. Despite having a composite picture from witnesses and receiving many calls, no one had turned in a viable suspect. Numerous elderly women had pointed to their scepter as bus drivers, and neighbours with grudges had guided police towards people they disliked. Psychics provided empty assistance, and one tip suggested witchcraft as a motive. A cult did practice in a nearby park, so that lead was not entirely discounted. The best clue investigators had was identifying the manufacturer of the shoe that had left a footprint in one of the murder scenes. They found a man with similar shoes of the right size who knew the victim, but he was ultimately not linked to the crime. Despite calls for Leoard Christopher's release, his murder trial began in November. In the Court of Common Pleas, a jury heard the opening statements on November the 29th, 1990, shortly after Thanksgiving. Leoard Christopher was dressed in a grey suit and black horn-rimmed glasses, looking, as the papers reported, studious. He seemed a far cry from the demented killer thought to be running around Frankfurt, raping and killing women over the past 5 years. Assistant District Attorney Judith Rubino portrayed Christopher as a vicious killer who used a Rambo-style knife to slash and kill Carroll Dowd in the alley behind the fish market where he worked. While she admitted to having no witnesses to the actual murder, Rubino emphasized the circumstantial evidence. She claimed that multiple witnesses saw Christopher with Dowd in the alley and heard a woman scream. Additionally, Christopher was seen leaving the alley and Dowd was found dead immediately afterward. Witnesses saw him with a knife and his clothing had blood on it. Furthermore, Christopher lied about his whereabouts that night and made other peculiar statements about the murder. Defense attorney Jack McMahon countered by portraying Christopher as a mild-mannered, well-liked individual with no history of violence. He argued that the police, under pressure to solve the case, had rushed to judgment. McMahon suggested that the 6 prior cases with similarities indicated the work of a serial killer and not Christopher. However, this line of reasoning faced objections from the prosecutor, and Judge George Irvins cautioned McMahon to stick to the facts. Despite the interruptions, McMahon continued, stating pressure sometimes presents unreliable results. He criticized the police for relying on evidence that would have been discarded in stronger cases, implying that this had led to mistakes. McMahon questioned the credibility of the witnesses, noting that they were prostitutes and junkies with lengthy arrest records and multiple aliases. He highlighted Emma Lee's admission of lying twice to the police about the incident, initially denying knowledge because she liked the defendant. This, McMahon argued, made her an unreliable witness. McMahon then pointed out that when the police arrested Christopher, he had no injuries and no physical evidence linked him to the crime scene. No murder weapon was recovered, and the so-called Rambo knife was never found. Therefore, there was no reason to view Christopher as a murderer. Despite McMahon's arguments, the case wasn't straightforward. The combination of circumstantial evidence, questionable witness credibility, and the pressure on the police to solve the case added layers of complexity. The jury faced the challenging task of sifting through the evidence and testimonies to determine whether Christopher was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Prosecutor Rubino countered McMahon's presentation by highlighting Christopher's behaviour and statements that indicated knowledge of the crime beyond what had been publicly disclosed. On the morning after Dowd's murder, Christopher told his boss, Joseph Fang, that a white woman, about 45 years old, had been murdered in the alley. Since the police had not revealed these details to anyone, this was suspicious. Additionally, Christopher made a strange comment to Fang a few days after the murder, saying, "Maybe I killed her." Although he quickly recanted, his serious demeanour and curiosity about the incident were troubling. Fang testified that Christopher had mimed gutting a person while describing the crime and claiming to have seen a white man on the street at 1 a.m., but no one else had reported that sighting. Instead, all the witnesses from the street that night had seen Christopher. Joseph Fang testified on December 3rd that Christopher had told her 5 days after the murder that he had been unable to sleep well because he had witnessed a murder. His speech was rambling and his manner was agitated. He said he thought a white man who knew he had seen it was trying to kill him and could get into his apartment to hide in the closet. The next day, Christopher was arrested. The prosecution's physical evidence included a tiny spot of blood on Christopher's trousers, too small to type, and a blood-stained tissue of type O, Dowd's blood type, found in a driveway next to Christopher's apartment building. Christopher claimed to have seen a well-dressed white man in his 40s outside that night, wiping his hands on something resembling a handkerchief or tissue, but he had not been in his girlfriend's apartment as he claimed. The trial was short, and closing arguments came quickly on December the 11th. Defense attorney McMahon emphasized Christopher's good character and the lack of a motive, weapon, or solid evidence from the prosecution. He argued that Christopher's statement about the white man on the night of the murder fit the description given by other witnesses about men seen with earlier victims. McMahon dismissed the prosecution scenario as nonsensical and told reporters, "The case stinks. It's garbage." ADA Rubino, meanwhile, countered by questioning the motive for witnesses to lie, noting that some of them were friends with Christopher. She reminded the jury of 2 witnesses who saw Christopher talking to Dowd in a bar at midnight on the night she was murdered, and testimony from Christopher's girlfriend, Vivian Carter, that he had not been with her that night. Rubino closed with an emotional appeal, describing the terror Dowd must have felt during the attack, pointing to the cuts on her hands as evidence of her desperate struggle. After the judge's instructions, the jury deliberated for more than 4 hours before being sequestered for the night. By the next day, it was apparent that the jury believed the prosecution's case. On December the 12th, after 4 more hours of deliberation, they convicted Christopher of the first-degree murder of Carroll Dowd. Some jury members were visibly upset by the decision. Leoard Christopher showed no visible reaction, but his defense attorney shook his head in disbelief. Despite the prosecutor's request for the death penalty, Christopher was sentenced to life in prison. He felt he had been railroaded by pipers. These are prostitutes cajoled into testifying by the police. Apart from the strange admission to his boss, Christopher had confessed to nothing. Defense attorney McMahon suggested that the real killer, who Christopher referred to as the Northeast Stalker, may still be out there. Was McMahon right? The conviction left lingering doubts about whether the true perpetrator of the Frankford slayings had been caught. With Christopher behind bars, the debate about his guilt and the possibility the real killer still at large continued to haunt the community. Despite Leoard Christopher's conviction for the murder of Carroll Dowd, the Frankford Slasher case remains shrouded in controversy and unanswered questions.
Just a completely out of the blue, totally psychotic act by a man who never exhibited anything of that nature before.
Bluestein says that final murder was proof Christopher was not the serial killer and raises deep doubt about the Dowd conviction.
Not only was Ms. Dowd never given justice because her murderer was never found and caught. The other 8 women, those murders are still unsolved.
Despite public perception to the contrary, police have long acknowledged that Christopher was not the Frankford Slasher. Only, they insist, the killer in Dowd's case. Quote, homicide detectives could not link him to the other cases, but he was arrested and convicted based on that particular case's merits. Christopher died behind bars at Huntingdon Prison while serving a life sentence.
Antonio Mendoza's book on unsolved serial killings does not include the Frankford Slasher case, despite the significant victim count. Mendoza adheres to the outdated and erroneous FBI statistic that there are between 35 to 50 serial killers at large in the US. While it's true that many murders appearing to have a common predator remain unsolved, it's not always prudent to assume they are the work of a serial killer. The bungled Boston Strangler case serves as a cautionary tale. There were good suspects for many of the 11 murders attributed to the Strangler, and technically some of these murders could still be considered unsolved. The semen found on the last Boston Strangler's victim, Murray Sullivan, did not match Albert DeSalvo, who was considered the Strangler. Additionally, DeSalvo's descriptions of Sullivan's and other murders were riddled with errors overlooked by investigators eager to close a terrifying case. As of this writing, at least 7 or 8 of the Frankford Slasher's murders remain unsolved. One murder occurred while Christopher was in jail, raising the possibility of a copycat or that not all the killings were related. Even if all the murders were the work of a single killer and Christopher was not the perpetrator, no further crimes fitting the slasher's pattern have occurred in the area since 1990. However, significant questions remain about the evidence used to convict Christopher and the discrepancies between his appearance and witness reports describing a white man seen with other victims. It appears someone else may have gotten away with murder. Today, the Frankfurt area is undergoing a renaissance, poised for renovation and rebirth as an arts community. Residents want to forget its seedy past and focus on expansion and expression. In 2000, the Philadelphia Inquirer reported that Frankfurt was statistically one of the safer neighborhoods in the city. While the Frankfurt Slasher casts a long shadow of menace over the area, today's citizens believe that the neighborhood's negative reputation is undeserved. Thank you for watching. What are your thoughts on this? Please let us know if there are any cases or subjects you would like us to cover. Suggestions are always welcome, and if you enjoyed this video, please like, share and subscribe. In the meantime, stay safe and keep your loved ones close.